Oh boy, it's another great day today. I can't wait to see what's happening in my favorite game. Oh, new skin? Great. I'm just gonna get my credit card right here.
2 weeks later.
Ah, great. Another new update for my favorite game. I wonder what's happening this time. Oh, another one in a row? Well, I haven't got my pay in, but sure. Oh boy, third update in a row. I wonder what's happening this time. Why do they have to schedule stuff like this? Like, do they expect us to be made of money or something? Well, time to go rob a bank. When it comes to live service games, frequently you see many dev teams talk about how they have content planned for 1, maybe 2 or even 3 years into the future. But when you think about it, we aren't exactly seers. We don't know what is gonna happen in the future. And while some people might think that I'm some kind of weird time wizard, the fuck is going on here? That isn't exactly the case either. So what a team might think is gonna work 3 years into the future when they say that they have a 3-year plan may not exactly be the case. You know, things could always go worse. You could have a plan for season 1, season 2 and beyond for the future of your game as you release it full of optimism, and then you end up like Overwatch 2 where the only thing people look for in your game is the smart online. And you know, you have this little thing planned over here and it goes like bum, 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 and it's gone forever. So things may not always necessarily go to plan. Many things will change, especially in the earlier years of the game where the team still has to figure out what its fans truly enjoy about the game, as well as how to position itself in the industry that is going to be constantly growing as well. In such a situation, how do teams even actually prepare so many years in advance? After all, some content is likely going to be subject to change depending on how they feel the sentiments in the player base are changing. And so when they say a 3-year plan is in place, what exactly do they actually mean? Well, as someone who has worked in live service in the past, let's talk about that. So needless to say, when a live ops team is planning the schedule, there are 2 things that they really need to focus on. It's a lot like that one Calvin and Hobbes meme, where they go like everything is basically just one of 2 specific categories. And in the case of live ops planning, everything is either focusing on growth in terms of DAU or growth in terms of profits. Collab, typically that's meant to influence the number of active users you have, the DAU. When you talk about high difficulty content, that's meant to affect your profits. An anniversary event, that's typically somewhere in the middle due to the fact that with an anniversary event, it does act as a good time, especially in this modern day and age where people expect games to actually do something for the anniversary and make it big and grand. You can just look at how people complain when the reverse isn't true. And as a result of that, it's a very good way to get new players in, and it's also a good way to sell very unique anniversary related stuff that could also attract people to spend simultaneously. New character release in one of those gacha games, that's typically more of a profit thing, since it is something that people from the outside looking in won't really connect with as much, but there are times where just the art alone is enough to get people intrigued into trying out the game, especially if there's a lot of organic marketing or basically people creating fan art for it. And so while it's typically more focused on profits, it can also affect your DAU growth. That said, these are 2 things that typically stand at odds with each other because of the fact that if you're focusing on growing your DAU, it basically means that you're trying to do things that would attract people to not only come in and play your game, but to stay for the long term, which more often than not, that also means that you're going to have to do stuff that is more friendly, which is going to affect your profits. Meanwhile, if you're going to go full into trying to maximize your profits, the reverse is true, where you're probably going to end up driving away players who don't want to spend as much, and as a result, you're going to affect the growth of DAU instead. So a growth in DAU, while it is a nice metric, it doesn't help with short-term profitability growth. And the issue with the balance of these 2 is the fact that while most people, I'm sure, at the development level in these companies do want to make and continue to put out content that is fun and interesting for the players, there's also the issue of the fact that many of these games are basically run or published by very big companies, most of which are publicly traded. And so to these companies, showing short-term growth which they can then present to their shareholders to show that the company is growing is as important, if not and sometimes more important than the long-term growth of the company. And this can make it very difficult for the company or the team within it to balance both of these 2 points. And as such, the live ops schedule planner, typically the director and the team, is someone whose job it is to then understand what the goals of the project are and then plan a schedule for the year or each individual year within the 3-year plan to fit best what the planned schedule of the overall company is. Now, obviously, this sounds like it's very cold and very mechanical rather than something that a person who's supposed to be making a piece of entertainment should be thinking about. And you know what? It actually is. It actually truly is. But while, people typically who are working in the development side of such stuff, they want to focus on making something interesting first, there are also many people, especially in the more business side of the company, especially in the upper management whose job it is to push profits, who don't share that opinion as much. And so there is always some level of conflict that happens within a team as they try to find a good middle ground when it comes to balancing making something enjoyable and making something that is profitable. So teams have targets both in terms of DAU as well as in profits, especially in terms of live service games. These tend to be set very early into the game's development cycle. Not even like after it's released, then they decide these are our targets, but even right from when they go into development itself, typically there are already goals being set, and it is precisely because of the goals that certain actions are being taken in developing the title as well. As such, we're going to split this video into 2 parts to talk about how the schedule planning is done prior to the title's release and how it is done after the title has already released, especially after the initial schedule that has been planned has already run its course and a new one needs to be designed, as the ways that the team would go about doing this changes a lot over this period of time. So at this point before release, there isn't typically very much data that the team can actually use within the game itself to make its decisions. So it has to really look outward to try and figure out how best to schedule and estimate how much the game would earn. Especially nowadays, if you're trying to bring your game to a publisher to get them to release the title under them and to provide some support in terms of marketing and the like, they typically would at minimum ask you for a 1-year schedule of what is your content plan for the first year and what type of content you're planning to release and all of that. And the way you would typically go about doing this is by setting up benchmark competitors and trying to figure out how much those companies that are already out there are presently earning. Now, especially back in the day, this used to be a lot harder, but thankfully nowadays, because of the fact that platforms are more centralized, it kind of gets a little bit easier as data can be pulled from these platforms and estimated in a way that can be somewhat reliable, especially considering the fact that there are so many tools out there now. It really does make it a lot easier for companies to then use all of this data to try and get a rough gauge of how the competitors are doing and therefore how much they can therefore expect to earn themselves by looking at games that are targeting a similar-ish audience and then trying to figure out how much they earned, and based off all of that, you try to then estimate how much you can expect to earn in profits as well. So at this point, I'm going to assume that the team aren't just complete ghouls who are trying to make a title that's going to go out, release for a year, and instantly EOS with the intention of squeezing money out of the player base. Like, if we go about assuming that everybody is trying to do that, this video probably doesn't even need to be made, and I'm actually wasting my time right now talking to a camera and pretending that like I am not growing too old for maybe all of this YouTube stuff with the internet and all. So for the purpose of this video, we're just gonna assume that the team wants to, as far as possible, run the title for as long as they can and keep it as sustainable as possible so that they can provide as much entertainment as they reasonably can with the title that they are releasing. In that case, the team actually needs to plan and balance around having periods of high profitability and periods of chill. It's kind of like actual level design in a game as well, in a way where you don't want the game's difficulty to just be constantly going up in a straight line like this, because it actually just constantly gives the player more and more stress, and in some ways it can actually cause the players to tune out of the game because of the constant pressure they are feeling. And so typically what you want to do is you want it to go up to a certain point and then you have it drop back down a little bit, but not all the way back to below where it used to be. and then have it slowly taper back up again, and then you would do this over and over again. For the first year, this is typically a lot easier to predict because you can kind of guess if you've looked at most of the data that exists out there for most of the games that have released, especially in the mobile game space, that obviously you're gonna have your most profitable month in the very first month of the very first year, and then it starts to taper down from there, and it will basically start to decline all the way unless interesting content is added at points to both maintain player interest to keep your player active user count high, as well as to keep the profitability high. Now obviously there are exceptions to this, but for the most part, most titles do see something like this, and while they may not reach the first year's values ever again, they do tend to basically maintain at a certain level, maybe with just slight decreases every year, and the game can basically just survive off of this for maybe 7, 8, maybe even 10 years if they're lucky. And when it comes to gacha games especially, this is also why you do see there tend to be spikes every few months. So what most teams would try to do is maybe they'll go like 1 month of having something hype and maybe 1 to 2 months of having something chill, and then they'll just go back to something hype again. And if you do it in this manner, you can basically ensure that at the 6th month during a half anniversary and the first year at the anniversary itself, you can kind of coincide it in a way that you can have something hype happen at both of these and maybe have some smaller spikes along the way as well. Though that said, after the 2nd month, typically more so than the exact month number, what games typically look at instead are whether there are any real life events that they can make use of, or what their own internal planned content release schedule is to decide when to add in the hype content as well. And when it comes to the real life events, this is especially effective when there are certain real life events or holidays that you kind of do see people around the world sharing, even if not celebrating in the exact same ways, that they could then use as a period to basically release something that might be interesting and that might connect more with the players as well. Things like Christmas and the end of the year, this is when salary slaves such as myself actually get our bonuses, and as a result, people have a little bit more money to spend, and with the high spending propensity on such games in the East, this is also a very good time for them to then release more content to hopefully get more people to spend. Now, while Christmas isn't observed in the same way as in the West perhaps, it is true that it is still observed here to some extent in their own uniquely different ways. You can just ask KFC in Japan. But yeah, this is also when people do get their long holidays or their study breaks if they're schooling, and so it is a very good time when people are also free, and as a result, this is a good time for the games to release a lot more content and try to get people interested in playing and interested in spending. Swimsuits, especially in summer, need I say more? Okay, maybe I need to say a little more for the one guy who lives in the North Pole watching this video, as well as all the people in Southeast Asia or those who just live around the equator in general, where the state of the weather all the time is basically just fucking sucks. Summer is the only period in the entirety of the year, especially in countries with a season, where you have this 3-month, well, nowadays because of like global warming and shit, it's a little longer than 3 months, but where you have this long period where it's a lot hotter than in the rest of the year, and so people tend to stay indoors, and this is typically the period of the year where people can actually go out swimming in swimsuits and not feel like they're freezing to death in an eternal hellscape of winter. You know, especially for people like us who just don't touch grass very much in the first place. The grass is all gonna get burnt up by the summer heat, and so there's all the more no reason to be going out. But yeah, as a result of the fact that people don't leave their homes as much during this period, it's a lot better of a period of time to try to get people to try out your game as well. And so the release of characters and the release of like swimsuit skins and all of that is a good way to then just get people excited or hyped up for something that they can look forward to within the game as well. But yeah, generally content tied to IRL events are a little easier for teams to estimate and work around because it always happens at a fixed time of the year, and you can kind of then see how most games actually that release content in this specific manner do during that period of the year. With in-game content, it's typically gonna be a little harder to do this kind of planning simply due to the fact that your game will typically fall into one of two different categories. Either your game is one that's gonna be very similar to someone else's, Madagascar real. Or your game is one that's gonna be so completely different that it's kind of little hard to tell at the time whether or not it is something that is gonna do as well as the competitors that are targeting a similar-ish audience. But even then, you can kind of, at the very least, estimate it based off understanding what players are going to need in your game at certain points in the overall arcing schedule that you have planned. And therefore, when something new is released, whether or not it will do well, in order to do so, it basically assumes that the team has people who have a very good grasp of the gameplay loop, basically the loop of all the things that the players are expected to do constantly in the game as they go through it and progress. Like, you can think of it very simply as like if you're playing an RPG game, you have the player going into the dungeon, gets loot, he goes back to town, he buys and upgrades his gear, and then he goes back into the dungeon again. And this is like the most basic loop. Obviously, most games have more stuff going on than this, but you can think of it as like basically the figuring out what the loop of all of the different actions the player will want to take in your game are, and then figuring out what resources are lacking and what players are going to prioritize first, and then releasing content that is either using the resources that they don't need now and therefore are not trying to obtain, or trying to release content that will help them solve some of the pain points, the issues that they're finding with the current content. For example, you might have a boss that is very difficult because it has a specific gimmick, and at the start of the game, players may not have a good way to deal with that gimmick, and so you basically at some point release the way to resolve or make that gimmick easier to deal with. And you can expect that if people actually care a lot about clearing this specific piece of content, and it's something that you can expect people are going to spend money to try and get better at, then you releasing that will probably bring in a fair amount of profits. In the case of an MMO, it can vary a lot more since MMO upgrading systems tend to vary a lot more. But you can think of it as if a new raid that comes out actually uses very specific upgrades on the gear that you typically do not already have on your gear, and that requires items with a low success rate that you could spend money to get more of, like a scroll or something, to imbue those specific effects onto your gear. You can expect that, especially if the effects aren't very used in other dungeons, then, well, when you release this, people are gonna burn through their resources to try to get those effects, and that is where your money will then come in. General trend is that most games try to balance it between one of two ways. Either they release something that allows you to clear existing bosses a lot easier, therefore making you more competitive, and therefore you know that you need to spend on them, or they release certain characters prior to the boss's release instead, and these characters only then become useful when the boss actually comes out. And the reason why the latter is done is simply because it basically keeps the higher spenders, the whales, guessing, especially if you don't play in a delayed global server where you actually get prior information beforehand as to what works and what doesn't based off what has released in the other versions of the game. As this creates a level of FOMO within your top spenders, who therefore end up in this constant mindset of, yeah, I don't really like this character, they seem kind of useless, but maybe they might get useful in the future when a new boss releases, maybe I'll just spend on that now. The whole process of doing that may feel quite scummy, but it is a way that many games do go about trying to ensure that people do spend on many of the banners. And it is actually also a part of why you do see that games tend to, when a server is actually released later on, that later release server tends to perform monetarily a lot worse than the main server as well. Spending propensity, especially for global versus Japan, Korea, is one thing, but aside from the spending propensity, there's also the fact that prior information does also cause the profitability to go down more than it otherwise would have. Yes, even if the Korean server is delayed behind the Japanese server, the spending propensity is still higher than America, but it is not at the highest it could be had the game released at the same time as the Japanese server, which is why many games nowadays, especially when you look at the Chinese ones or the Korean ones, they're trying to release the global servers simultaneously. That said, the reason why some games have delayed releases for other regions in spite of this is due to the fact that for some of them, it actually still makes more sense to actually delay the releases in this way, especially for smaller teams where they may not necessarily have a full in-house translation team, and a lot of that has to be outsourced to specialized translation teams outside of the team or the company instead. They might have one or two localization specialists in-house to basically just monitor the content that they get from these translation firms and make sure that it is consistent with both the story that they want to tell and as well as with the image that they want the game to have. But aside from that, because all of this content is coming from another firm that is outside of one's control, typically there is a need to set up a much bigger buffer time to ensure that they can actually fulfill the request in spite of their schedule of having other work from other companies as well. And also to set up time to ensure that all of the work can be checked through properly, since by virtue of the fact that these are completely different companies with people who just do translation for a living and aren't part of the team and therefore may not necessarily understand the direction of the team fully, there's the need and quite likely the case that there's going to be some level of bouncing the work between the company as well as the game development team to ensure that the content will come back and end up being in the state that they require it to be. And of course, there's some people might still wonder, well, if this other game can do it, why can't this game do it as well? Well, in that case, it typically depends a lot more on the scale of the company that you're talking about as well. Like, for example, if it's a small team that is not receiving a very big budget from the company is within, then they aren't likely going to be as able to pull off such a level of simultaneous release simply due to the fact that such a release is actually quite costly. Because whenever people produce content for a game, or for anything for that matter, they typically produce it in one language first. For example, when I make these videos, they tend to be in the England spoken word thing, I think. And so everything, if I were to try to make this video and then provide it to a Chinese audience, I would then need to basically translate this video and put subtitles here to make it readable, or maybe even do the entire video dubbing myself speaking in Bing Chilling instead. And what this means is that once the English version is done, it's just gonna sit there for a while and basically do nothing while I'm working on the Chinese version. And with a small team, especially one that is independent, the big issue at hand here is then the fact that if you leave the English version there and do nothing with it, then the additional time between that and the time that it takes to complete the Chinese version in this case, you're gonna be sitting around incurring additional costs, but not receiving any form of, well, profits or revenue at all. So you're basically gonna be tanking even more costs while trying to get everything else complete, which once again, for a big firm, this is something that you can do. But even then, it's not something that is very cost efficient. As such, it might make more sense for them to first release the game in specific regions that they can quickly get it out for, and then use that money to cover the costs or to earn some profits, while they can then use that money to then develop the other regions versions of the game and all of the translation and preparing all of the marketing materials and doing the marketing research to ensure that all of these games can do well in those other regions as well. And there are also many ways that a game can try to achieve its DAU targets, though the easiest way that games typically try to go about doing this is through the creation of periods where it's much easier for people to join in and start the game. You can typically think of it as the half anniversary and anniversary periods, things that basically have become a lot more normal for games to celebrate now, because they realize that it's a good way to get people excited, both to get their players to spend as well as to come back to the game, but also to get new players interested in trying out the game because of all the free stuff they're giving out in this celebration. I actually remember back when I was working in Koei Tech Mall, there used to be some kind of discussion about this as well, where someone actually brought up the point that with mobile games, MMOs, or live service in general in Japan, typically the issue is not how much can we give out, but how can we give out stuff in a way that doesn't make it seem like we're gonna give out stuff all of the time. Because trying to find a reason to give out even more stuff is what companies find to be very difficult. And giving out too much stuff at a single point simultaneously also kind of numbs the impact of how much they're actually giving out, as there's just so much stuff. Collabs are another big one as well, but typically you don't really earn that much more than a standard event within your game. In fact, there are probably going to be fans of your game who don't really like the fact that there's this weird crossover going on, and there's always the fine line that the game has to toe of how powerful do you want to make the collab characters, because adding in a collab character in and of itself is not going to boost your current player base sales, and making them too strong might turn away some of the players within the game itself. But these are typically a good way to get people into the game, and a well-balanced collab character can basically keep people playing for long, because with the whole strength of the IP that you're using to pull people in, if the character is then strong and usable within the game, you can basically keep people playing just so they can use their character, and this might keep them around long enough for them to want to stay and play your game for long. And so these are things that the game's developers need to factor in so as to ensure that the schedule is well balanced in the sense that when it comes to trying to draw new players in, you don't do it in a way that it causes your game's economy to get overly imbalanced and makes it unprofitable, while simultaneously also ensuring that you don't alienate your current existing player base due to the fact that just giving out far too much content that they may not be interested in. Once the team has decided that they have built in enough of these peak periods in the schedule for them to achieve the initial target, they then go on to decide what to do with the lull periods. You kind of are assuming that these periods will do fine, but not super well. And as a result, this also does mean that you can't really just do nothing during this period. Because remember, we live in an age where people
I've been edging, okay? Like sharpening a blade, edging?
Where people apparently have so much brain rot that they say the word edge and they think of aging instead and think if they said the wrong word. But yeah, we do live in an age now where there are so many people who are suffering from so much brain rot that they can't even watch a video without the video having a game playing within the video, or while they have a game playing on their second monitor as well. So the thing is that you don't want to have periods where nothing at all happens within the game, because that would actually actively cause your DAU to go down in the long term. And that is also a part of why so many games are on a 2-week event cycle. It is because of the fact that this 2-week cycle is the minimum right now, at least, that most games can go without putting too much pressure on the developers to constantly generate new content every single week, while also keeping the player base attracted and keeping their attention on the game as well. I actually did work in the past on a game that used to run on a 1-week cycle back in Koei Tecmo, and I can tell you that when it's on a 1-week cycle, initially when you first develop the title, it may seem fine, but when it comes to the actual live ops, the live service management that people have to do later on, it's not just the players that are gonna be suffering unless there's some kind of Saudi oil prince or something. Like, even the developers are gonna be suffering to try and get the assets ready for a new character every single week, and the level of stimulation it gives can actually numb people to actually wanting to play the game, since it basically means that if your work week is busy and you miss a single week, you're just gonna miss an entire event outright. So typically games don't go on 1-week schedules anymore, and 2 weeks is just about the right balance that they can go with to maintain player attention while keeping enough of a buffer for them to do other stuff as well. But typically this is where things will get a little more vague in terms of how the team plans for them, because of the fact that when it comes to these lull periods or periods where the game is planning to release events that it knows it won't do as well, typically these events function a little more like Lego pieces, you can think of it as, where these are gonna be small events that they're gonna be able to remove from the schedule around the important events that they know have to be released in this specific fixed periods, and that they can then shift around whenever there's a need to, or even change around the characters or items that will turn up within these events. One example of this is what Blue Archive did with the 5th PV, where they basically had a video during the 3rd anniversary which teased some of the events that were going to release going forward, by basically doing a montage trailer teaser that showed some of what might be potential events with the characters and different outfits, to basically show that, like, hey, you know this character that you really like? You might see them release this year with different outfits soon. Are they gonna be gonna? You're gonna have to play on to find out, or something like that. There were also some events that were only just teased in name, where the scene just changes for like 1 to 2 seconds to a screen with text on it, and then it just transitions to the next one. And the reason for things like this is so that they get some level of plausible deniability that even if they don't release the event, most people probably wouldn't notice it. And if they do put in something else into this period because of the fact that they realize that profits maybe are too low and they want to put in something that might sell a little better, they still would be able to get away with doing that, since they aren't displaying all of the content in the trailer to give you a fully fixed schedule. And some authors on Reddit will probably find a way to conspiracy theory all of this out of thin air and join the dots in a way that makes everything look like it makes sense and say like, haha, see, I knew all along that they were going to release this event, even though arguably even the devs themselves didn't know that they were going to do it. Hence, a full 1-year schedule pre-release will consist of core content which the team thinks will either draw in players to play the game or spend more, or that will just be very entertaining to keep people playing for longer, as well as events that tend to be a little lower priority that are meant to be shuffled around as needed, or even replace with higher profitability events when the situation changes based off how the game is currently performing. There is a lot of uncertainty in whether or not something will succeed, but when it comes to getting stuff done, the time spent to get stuff done is fairly short because these are typically built into the schedule itself. So in terms of production, it's not very difficult for them to incorporate that into the workflow and get it done on time. That said, when it comes to post-release, these 2 points actually invert. Now there will be a lot less uncertainty, especially if you have the right tools set up, since you basically now have access to all of the player behavior within your game, as well as all of the player feedback on what they think works and what doesn't, and therefore you can get a much better grasp of what the player base likes and enjoys about your game and what they interact with the most. However, when it comes to actually creating something new, the amount of time taken is a lot more, simply due to the fact that the team's attention is now split between trying to maintain the game as it currently is, while also trying to produce all of the content that you will need going forward from this point on. And this is especially so because of the fact that at this point the team should, after a year or two of operation, have pretty good idea of what makes the peak periods pretty peak and what makes the lull periods as chill as they are, and therefore it'll be a lot easier to release content that is more fitting for these two periods. Especially for mobile games, it becomes a lot easier to figure out when to release characters that you know are gonna be popular because you have the data of what type of characters the players are into already. Or maybe you have even bigger like trend data for what general consumers within the subgenre of players that you're trying to target generally enjoy, and therefore you know something would do well better than you did before, and it's easier to therefore plan around all of this to set up periods where you know the game's definitely going to do well, and you know that these other characters aren't as popular, and therefore when it comes to the lull periods, you can release these characters, let the people who enjoy these characters get a chance to get in and be like happy that their characters are also getting new versions, or they're getting new characters that they like too, and then you can go back on and on in this fashion where you give each of the individual targeted niches their time, so they also are happy and enjoying your game. And there are many ways that the team could go about calculating all of this. Like one example would be something like FGO, for example, where every bond after the 10th level is a lot harder to get. And when it comes to grilling as well, grilling a 5-star character is a lot less efficient than grilling one of a lower rarity, simply because they do not gain as many levels from which to get EXP from. But based off the characters that people are prioritizing for both of these, you can kind of get a sense of where the player base is at in terms of which are the characters that they're using the most and they feel like they really need to min-max the stats for, and also which characters they like the most. Even things such as checking your player base's support list is something that you could do. So with something like FGO, where some people like to flex by putting every single character in their support list as the same character, you can essentially use that as well to get a gauge of like, okay, so these are the characters that people are not just rolling for because they're strong, but probably because they really like the characters as well. So we can check how much of the player base is actually doing this. And when it comes to the banners themselves, it's a little tougher for those because of the fact that a strong banner with a popular character are both gonna do very well, and if both are mixed together, it might create some level of noise. But you can typically try to figure this out by intentionally releasing a strong banner and a popular character separately, so the popular character may not be as strong, as still usable, and you just try to compare the data. That all of that goes a lot more into like actual data analysis rather than scheduling. So we'll leave that aside for now, otherwise this video is gonna be already far too long than it already is gonna be. So moving on. However, because of the time it takes to plan out a bigger event, especially one that may have unique content that isn't something that is released regularly, these events tend to be worked on a much longer span of time. With a smaller event, they tend to be worked on for, depending on how complicated it is to implement the content required, maybe 3 months, maybe even less depending on the game. I think the most scuffed one I worked on was a browser game really back in the day, where the updates that we were working on them maybe like 1 month thereabout before the actual release. And this can lead to some very interesting or strange situations as well, where, for example, if an artist leaves the company, even like 6 months down the road, you might very well see that artist's work being released in the game, just due to the fact that they may have a contract that had them prepare it maybe many months before, But since this event was meant to release much later, then it only appears in the game at that point. Collabs are also much easier to plan at this point simply due to the fact that you would now have access to both the actual DAU as well as revenue figures to be able to show both of these to the collab company to try and get a better and more favorable deal when working on stuff like this. Because as much as we would like to believe that collabs are basically two people, very like the creative heads excitedly coming together and going like, ooh, wouldn't it be interesting if my thing was inside your thing? Not in a lewd way, of course. Typically, what the hope is that both IPs will actually see a surge in popularity as people from the opposing side will go and view the other thing as well. This is also why you typically don't see gacha games with fairly similar-ish styles or subgenres or targeting similar niches actually collabing with each other. It's simply due to the fact that in doing so, you're basically funneling your player base to your competitor's game, which might actually harm your game in the long term, which is why many companies just try to stay away from that in general. Collabs also take much longer than your standard event to finalize and get all of the assets prepared for, even if the event is largely a very simple, like by the books event style that your game typically runs, simply due to the fact that all content within the collab needs to be checked by the other sides, the IP holder instead. And when I say everything, I really do mean everything, because in the end, it comes down to what they are willing and want to ensure is consistent with their branding. And so what you would see is that if a IP was fairly lax, they might only check specific things, such as if your game has a story, or if your game has certain character skills that are supposed to be tied to the game, then they'll probably want to check those as well as the character art to make sure the art conforms to their standards. But in the very, very extreme cases, you might see teams sometimes that might even request that everything that is in your game, every single dungeon stage, how does the stage flow, all of that needs to be sent to them. What are their actual parameters, right down to like the individual like attack defense stats. So there are some who would check all of that as well. And for some, it's a lot stricter in what they will approve than others, and so this could go through multiple sets of iteration. And in some cases, especially for older IPs, you might see the case that there are multiple conflicting versions of the same localization or the terms used within the IP. I think the biggest example I can think of was back in the day when I worked on the Hunter x Hunter one for a different company. What basically happened was that they actually made me read through, or rather watch through, 3 different versions of the anime. I think there was the Blu-ray version, the one on Netflix, and they found like a third one on Crunchyroll as well, to ensure that the terminology used in each of these were the same. And it turns out that, hey, it actually ends up being different. And because this was a rerun of the collab after, I think, like maybe 6-7 years, the terms that were approved in the first time the collab was run and the terms that are used now in the most recent release on Netflix were different because of the fact that the localizers were different. And so there was this whole thing of like having to jump through multiple hoops to try and confirm with them which one to use, because even the teams themselves sometimes don't know. As a result, these do tend to get worked on for a longer period of the game's run cycle, simply because of the fact that these you really need to ensure that they get implemented in time, because you typically do have to sign a contract stating that we will run this collab from this day to this day, and these are the specific things that we will be doing within the collab. So everything down to like, if you want to like re-release a additional buff to the character a year later, that needs to be approved in either this contract or signed in a separate contract. And the thing is that if you miss the date itself, it can be very problematic trying to get it shuffled to another period. Missing your own event, it's kind of like missing your own birthday after you invite everyone to come for it. It's a little awkward, it feels quite silly. People may never come to the birthday for the rest of your life. It would be basically just like me. But aside from that, the ramifications at least are a lot less bad than if you were to sign a contractual obligation with a company to let them run like something during your birthday, and then you just don't have the birthday happen at all, and they're just not able to fulfill their part of the contract. Can we do anything about it at all, or are you just gonna have to pay them for the contract non-fulfillment? So there's a lot more issues there that a company would want to avoid, and therefore these events tend to be worked on with a higher priority than some of the smaller events, for example. But that said, this typically only applies to if you're trying to come up with something new, such as a collab or a milestone event for your event. And when it comes to the smaller events, typically it's something that the event itself is very easy to think up and implement in terms of what the event is going to play like, because it's typically going to be something that is fairly simple and generic to the game itself. Okay, so video long, monkey brain, no work, me tired too. Yes. Live ops, pre-release, schedule easy, but unstable. After release, plan schedule, very chaos, much sad. Fuck, why did I make that meme? But implementation easy, so people happier, is how most of it runs. But yeah, that's all for me for today. Thank you all for watching. I hope this video was interesting, because with this one, I do feel like it's a little more vague-ish, maybe, compared to the visual novel, like locale one, since this one is really just talking about the mindsets of how people go about like planning these schedules within these games, which as a result of the fact that it's, you know, something that is more of a soft skill rather than a hard skill, there isn't exactly a number that you crunch to say that this event is definitively better than this one. Rather, it's a lot of looking at people's emotions and what you think people will find interesting and planning around all of that. Even with data on hand, player sentiment can shift a lot over time. So yeah, like a lot of this planning can be very chaotic, and so a lot of it, or like what I'm saying, maybe it might be a little less interesting. If it is, I do apologize, but either way, I hope it was an interesting video for you guys nonetheless. Thank you to the people who helped to support this channel. It helps with the making of all of the content that I do, including videos like this, where I basically just stand in front of a camera and talk about something that I've worked on in the past, I guess, in a way. Maybe I should be focusing on work at times as well. I still do. Sometimes I still have to work overtime, but none of that really matters right now. All that matters is that you and me, I pointed at the screen on the camera instead of the lens itself. You and me, my friend, we have something cool that we did today, I hope. Until next time, I'll be seeing you guys in a week or two. But until then, take care and bye-bye.